Welcome to Final Fantasy IX Translation Analyses, the video series where I compare the English and Japanese scripts of the game and go over the most fun and interesting differences between them. Last time we left off when the party leaves the Black Mage village and heads towards Kuja's palace. As you'll know if you've played Final Fantasy IX, this is the point in the game where we get a ton of long dungeons in a row with way less cutscenes and dialogue than before, so we're going to cover a lot of ground in this episode and go over a lot of references that were lost in translation. After Kuja captures our party, Zidane calls him a konoyaro in Japanese, which can be translated as you bastard, but in English he calls him a rat bastard. I wonder how Freya would feel about that. Doesn't exactly seem like the best insult for someone involved in the genocide of a race of rat people, you know? But anyway, in English, Kuja's humble abode is called Desert Palace, which is quite a simplification compared to its Japanese title, Haitoku no Kyuden, Desato Empress. As you can see, the Japanese version even gives us the obvious translation of the name of the place, Desert Empress, while its introductory title, Haitoku no Kyuden, means the Palace of Immorality. And while we're discussing the names of places, we then head towards Mount Gulug, which is another reference to a previous Final Fantasy that was lost in translation because the English version went with a localization of the name that differed from its original appearance in Final Fantasy I, where it was called Gulug Volcano in the original NES release and Mount Gulg in later versions. Speaking of references lost in translation, it's possible that the name of the Eidolon we acquire in Mount Gulug, Madin, is also one such reference, as it is reminiscent of Maduin from Final Fantasy VI, and you could say they share some other similarities, as they're both muscular bipedal summons with a special relation to one of the party members, although one is male and the other is female. But the thing is, their names aren't written exactly the same in Japanese. The Final Fantasy VI summon is Madin, while the Final Fantasy IX summon is Madin, with a prolonged E sound. So the similarity could be coincidental. Another thing that's somewhat unclear is whether the name of Madin's attack was truly meant to be called terrahoming, or rather, terraforming. In Japanese it's called terrahoming and not terraforming, which is the most common way to say terraforming in Japanese. However, terrahoming is also used to mean that sometimes, so it could still be the case. So we can't really say for sure, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess terraforming was the intended name, since terrahoming just sounds like nonsense to me. Speaking of Terra, that's where we're headed. When we get there, we meet Mikoto, who tries to lure Zidane away from his friends. At one point, she approaches Eiko and asks, "Where is your man?" Naturally, Eiko is super flustered by this question. She's also flustered in Japanese, even though Mikoto didn't call Zidane your man there. In Japanese, when asking about Zidane, Mikoto refers to him with the word kare. Now, kare can mean boyfriend, but most of the time it simply means he, that is, the male third-person pronoun in Japanese. However, in Japanese, third-person pronouns like kare, he, or kanojo, she, denote some level of intimacy. You wouldn't use them for strangers or for someone you've only met recently. Instead, you'd probably use their name with an appropriate honorific suffix, or a less intimate term like anohito, which literally means that person. And that's why Eiko freaks out when Mikoto refers to Zidane with the intimate kare and tells her that even she, who's been traveling with Zidane for a while, doesn't refer to him that way. Now, of course, this is impossible to translate literally because in English, referring to a stranger with he is perfectly normal, so the translator had to find some solution to justify Eiko's outrage, and thus, in English, Mikoto asks Eiko, "Where is your man?" Which is probably even more bold and inappropriate than the Japanese question, but it's an understandable choice and solution to a tricky line, and it makes for a pretty funny moment. Afterwards, Mikoto has an exchange with Zidane when the latter realizes he is a genome just like the inhabitants of Branbal. She confirms that to be true and tells him, "Yes, I am glad you understand." Zidane replies with, "I don't wanna understand. Sorry, but I'm not like that." In Japanese, Zidane's reply is a bit different. 理解したくもないけどな。 Ainiku sokomade manuke janai. I don't want to understand, but unfortunately, I'm not that much of an idiot. Realizing the truth about his origins, Zidane goes to confront Garland, who tells him that both he and Kuja were created to be angels of death. The Japanese term is one you might be familiar with if you've watched a lot of anime, Shinigami, literally meaning God of Death, often translated as Grim Reaper, but Angel of Death is an equally valid and pretty inspired translation, and I'm glad they went with it. It just sounds so much cooler. Meanwhile, in the City series, the term Shinigami was translated as Reaper, with Kuja's mannequin being called Capricious Reaper. After Zidane resists him, Garland tries to reduce him to a soulless genome, and Zidane begins to lose his sense of self. In Japanese, when this happens, his speech ceases to be written in the usual hiragana and kanji, and becomes full katakana. In Japanese fiction, this is usually the way the dialogue of robots and the like is written, so it's a neat way to show that he's losing his soul and kind of ceasing to be a person, until his friends step in to help him, of course. But before he opens his eyes, Zidane sees his friends in his mind, and each one of them gets a line and says something about him. In Japanese, Eiko tells Zidane that he's always showing off, and Steiner follows up by saying that he's always fooling around. But for some reason in English, Steiner just calls him a worthless mendicant, which seems significantly more hostile, and that's not even the last time someone insults Zidane during the English version of this scene. Later, Amaranth goes, "Damn hypocrite, always talking about friendship when you're nothing but a selfish loner." This is a memorable remark, but again, it's very scathing. In Japanese, salamander sounds a bit nicer. 人にはおせっかい焼いといててめえは自分だけで全て解決か? Which can be translated as, "You're always poking your nose in other people's business, but now you want to solve everything by yourself?" Basically, Salamander is suggesting that Zidane is a busybody when it comes to other people's problems and is always trying to help them solve their issues, but he doesn't know how to ask or even how to accept help when he has a problem of his own. In Japanese, they continue to use the term Salamander uses here, osekkai, meaning a busybody, for the rest of the scene. Zidane tells everyone they're a bunch of idiotic busybodies, or babysitting bastards as the English translation puts it, but acknowledges he's one himself and even the worst of the lot. Finally, Garnet is able to get him to accept their help, after which he and Steiner have the following exchange in English. What am I gonna do with you guys? The feeling is mutual. In Japanese, the term osekkai is once again utilized here. まったくおせっかい野郎ばかりだぜ。お互い様なのである。We can roughly translate this as, I swear, goddamn busybodies the lot of you. You're one to talk. Anyway, these were some differences that I found interesting, but there's no bigger point here since obviously this scene is godly in either version. But enough about Zidane, let's focus on his big brother now. After Zidane and Garland fight, Kuja makes his appearance, and the weakened, kneeling Garland asks him, Kuja, what are you scheming? In English, he replies with, Scheming? Me? Watch me as I defeat these enemies of Terra. This is somewhat easy to miss, but notice that Kuja is bowing to Garland when he says this, and that's because in Japanese, Kuja is speaking with a mocking, ironically obsequious tone towards Garland, using kenjogo, the most humble form of Japanese speech, which, as I mentioned before, Zidane also used when he bowed to Garnet and made his vow to her at the beginning of the game. Here's how Kuja's lines go in Japanese. 私めがテーラのためにこの虫けらを退治してご覧に入れましょう. As usual, this kind of stuff is harder to convey in English, which is probably why the translators didn't even make an attempt at it. But I think you could do it with a translation like, Allow thy humble servant to exterminate these vermin in service of Terra. Of course, despite this humiliation, Garland kind of gets the last laugh after he reveals to Kuja his limited lifespan. In English, he tells him, You were created to destroy. You are immortal. In Japanese, he says, 永遠ならざる時のため作られた死神。
それがお前の存在理由だ。You were created as a transient angel of death. That is the purpose of your existence.
Kuja doesn't really take this well, to say the least, and before destroying the entire planet of Terra, he says the following in English.
I won't let it happen. I won't let this world exist without me.
This is a perfectly valid translation, but the Japanese is slightly different, and since this is such an iconic line of his, let's take a look at it.
認めないよ。僕の存在を無視して世界が存在するなどと。
A somewhat more faithful translation could be,
I won't accept this. I won't accept it. A world that disregards my existence cannot be allowed to continue.
With that, Disc 3 comes to an end. When Disc 4 begins, we're back in the Black Mage village, where the Chocobo egg finally hatches and the Black Mages name the Chocobo Bobby Corwin. A weird name to be sure, but there's a reason for it, as it contains another reference to a previous Final Fantasy. Now, this is a reference that wasn't really lost in translation per se, but it was probably still lost to most English-speaking players, myself included when I first played it, because it relies on knowledge of a certain convention of Japanese language. See, in Japanese, when you have a name or a title with two words, it's quite common to pick the first syllables of each word and join them together as an abbreviation. For example, in Japan, Final Fantasy is called Faifan for short, because those are the first syllables of Final Fantasy. Likewise with Dragon Quest, which is often called Doraque, the first syllables of Doragon Questo. So that's where the reference comes in, as Bobby Corwin's abbreviation would be Boko, which is of course the name of Bartz's Chocobo companion in Final Fantasy V. This reference is made even clearer by Eiko's comments on the name in Japanese. In English, she says the name Bobby Corwin sounds great, but then asks why don't they just call him by his first name. But in Japanese, both times she comments on the name, she says it feels a little too long, thus inviting us to abbreviate it into Boko. Before we leave the Black Mage village, Mikoto makes a speech that impresses one of the Black Mages. It goes like this.
You saw Kuja's power. He destroyed the world by himself. You don't even have 1,000,000 in 1 chance of defeating him. You'll all die.
Wow, this girl knows lots of difficult words. Really? I don't think she really used any particularly difficult words though. In my opinion, the translator should have had her say perish instead of die, which is how she spoke in Japanese, saying horobiru, to perish, rather than shinu, to die, which is probably what prompted the Black Mage to comment on her vocabulary. Zedan then calls Mikoto cynical in English, which works, but the Japanese term he uses, hesomagari, is closer to a contrarian. When the party is about to enter Memoria, Beatrix, who's concerned about Steiner, tells the Pluto Knights beside her, "Your captain is about to enter Valhalla." Whoa, easy there, Beatrix. I mean, that makes it sound like she's convinced he's gonna kick the bucket soon. In Japanese, what she says is that Steiner is about to enter not an afterlife like Valhalla, but a shichi. This word is comprised of 2 kanji, the kanji for death and the kanji for place, but what it essentially means is an extremely dangerous place from which one might not return alive, whereas Valhalla is something you only enter after you die. So I'm not sure it was the best option there. Even with Beatrix and Cid's help, the party has to fight a boss battle against a dragon before entering the final dungeon. In English, this dragon is called Nova Dragon. In Japanese, its name consists of 2 kanji, the kanji for god, Shin, and the kanji for dragon, Ryu. So yes, its name is Shinryu, aka the recurring super boss of the Final Fantasy series, who made its debut in Final Fantasy V. You know, with all these missed references, I'm starting to suspect the translator wasn't very familiar with old-school 2D Final Fantasy games. However, they did seem versed in the other PS1 Final Fantasies, to the point that the English translation even introduced a new reference to them. I'm referring, of course, to the famous line in the very last scene in the game, "No cloud, no squall shall hinder us." In Japanese, the line is, "Mochiron da, tatoe ame ga futte mo arashi ga kitte mo." Translated very literally, this reads, "Of course, even if rain falls or a storm comes." So yeah, once again the translators went the extra mile here and definitely made up for the earlier references that were lost in translation by giving us a new one that was found in translation. Gotta give him props for that one, as it might just be my favorite reference in the game. Anyway, I digress, and obviously we'll cover the ending in way more detail next time, so let's return to Memoria for now. When we get there, Zidane asks Garland where they are. In English he says,
Memoria, a place of memories.
In Japanese, he simply says place of memories, as that is literally Memoria's name in Japanese, Kyoku no basho, place of memories. While we traverse Memoria, Garland chimes in every now and then to give us a piece of lore. In one of those instances he says,
Life on Terra was coming to an end. We had no choice but to proceed with a fusion, which tragically destroyed Terra's native civilizations.
Yeah, this is a mistake. The civilizations destroyed were from Gaia. The Japanese line clearly says Gaia no Bunme, aka Gaia civilization. He doesn't say Terra no Bunme. Moving on to his last words, in English, Garland wraps things up with his request.
Zidane, take care of Kuja.
In Japanese, he's less ambiguous, as he tells Zidane to straight up defeat Kuja. And then there's a line that didn't make it to English.
これが私の最後の頼みになろうとは皮肉なものだ. How ironic that this would be my last request.
Not one to disappoint, Zidane heads off to confront Kuja, who greets him with a speech about how he's going to destroy everything, which concludes with this laugh, which was actually added in English. In Japanese, he doesn't laugh there. Which is kinda funny because, for the most part, the English localization made Kuja laugh less often than in Japanese. Speaking of which, he then says,
Why should the world exist without me? That wouldn't be fair.
In Japanese, he actually starts this line with a laugh, and the line itself is a bit different.
自分の存在しない世界に一体何の価値があるというんだい?
A rather literal translation would be,
What value is there in a world where I don't exist?
Or we could turn it into a statement rather than a question to make it sound perhaps a bit more natural in English.
A world where I don't exist is worthless.
Before we can kick Kuja's butt though, we gotta fight Deaf Guys, whose name is, as you may know, a mistranslation of Deaf Gaze. Poor guy just can't catch a break, can he? They never get his name right. Even prior to this, his name was originally localized as Doomgaze in the original translation of Final Fantasy VI. Of course, in that case, it wasn't an accidental mistranslation like in Final Fantasy IX, but rather an intentional censoring, as Final Fantasy VI came out for the Super Nintendo, and therefore the English script had to abide by Nintendo's censorship rules, and the word deaf in particular was a no-no. Even though the game's main villain talked about death all the time in Japanese. Anyway, after we defeat Deaf Gaze, Kuja says,
Well, my time is almost up. Time to die, everyone!
Once again, this is a valid translation, but the Japanese line is a bit different, so let's take a look at it.
僕の命もあとわずかだ。君たちを道連れにしてあげよう。そして何もかもなくなるがいい!
We could translate this as,
My life is almost over, but you're all coming with me whether you want to or not. And then everything will cease to exist.
Phew. Kuja has no chill, does he? But guess what? His life isn't the only thing that's almost over. That's right, as you may have guessed by now, the next episode of this series will be the last. It's going to be a bittersweet goodbye, but it should also be one of the most interesting episodes, since both the confrontation with the final boss and the ending itself are full of fascinating differences in Japanese. We'll go over how Necron sounds in the original script, we'll talk about a key line of Zidane's that didn't make it to the English version, and we'll settle once and for all any lingering doubts about who is speaking during the blacked out screens in the epilogue. All that and much more. So make sure you don't miss it, and if you enjoyed this episode, give it a thumbs up and share it with anyone that might be interested. Alright, thanks for your continued support and stay tuned for the final episode, Chocobros. See ya!